The United States is still consulting its allies on a response to last week's gas attack in Syria. The world power is convinced the incident in Damascus was a chemical weapons attack. It's now considering a military strike against President Bashar al-Assad's government. So why has the US chosen to act now, and what are the implications for the region? The Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Centre, Jeenah, is now joining us in the studio. Naeem, thank you very much for coming in again.
Thank you, Dan.
Let's just take a look at this situation first. We saw what happened in the suburbs of Damascus last week. The people who died. It looks like chemical weapons were used. Now the US is preparing to strike against the Syrian. They are accusing them for being responsibility. That's going to be the crux of the matter, isn't it? Who used the chemical weapons?
Exactly, because there's no dispute among anyone that chemical weapons are used. The opposition, the Syrian regime, the United States, Russia, China, Iran, all agree that chemical weapons were used. The question is who used them. Up to now, there isn't conclusive evidence on that question. So you can't say with certainty that it was the regime. In fact, at the time that the chemical weapons were used, remember that weapons inspectors were in Damascus just a few kilometers up the road, literally, and that in that particular battle, the regime had the upper hand. So they were not desperate. They didn't have to. However, the United States, there's now some reports that the United States is saying that it had tapped into conversation by a senior leader in the army speaking to one of the chemical weapons units people, and it was a very panicked conversation just after the attack took place, and they're saying this implies that the weapons were set off by the regime, and perhaps some of the upper echelons didn't know about it.
Well, while they're still trying to come up with evidence, and obviously because America has learned in the Middle East, I mean, what we saw with Iraq some years ago about weapons of mass destruction and nothing was found, I think they've learned there. But we do know that some chemical weapon was used last week on the citizens of parts of Damascus. The situation is really has now gone from, you know, just a kind of a low intense clashes that have been happening to a bigger global issue now. I mean, Iran has said, if you go in there and attack Syrian government, we will attack Israel.
Yes, I mean, the situation right now is, in a sense, on a knife's edge. The United States has its ships on the coast of Syria. The British are sending their ships in. They prepared to attack with cruise missiles. If an attack takes place, and I'm not convinced yet, despite all the rhetoric, that an attack will take place. If it does take place, it'll be quick, short, cruise missile strikes. It will be more symbolic than making any great change to the civil war, actually. So it'll be a short strike, and they'll move out. The question is, you know, what use would that serve? Now, the thing is that despite the rhetoric, and you know, you saw John Kerry with his very emotional speech the other day, I think that there's lots of movement behind the scenes, particularly between the Americans and the Russians. There's a possibility that this upping of the temperature could actually force a situation where they agree to bring up the Geneva II conference, looking for a political solution. If that happens, then things will change quite substantially.
Where does this leave the Syrian National Coalition? I mean, they've been very much opposed to the government, and apparently reports coming out overnight said they've had some meetings with some of the diplomatic, including the US ambassador in Istanbul yesterday, to say, if you attack, these are the possible targets.
Yes, they've identified targets for the Americans. They, of course, would be quite pleased. They've been, certain elements of them definitely have been calling for many months now for the Americans to take a much more direct role. The Americans are not going to go further than a few cruise missiles. But for the SNC, that'll mean that you're getting the international community much more deeply involved.
Okay, just overall looking at the Middle East, you've got Egypt. Things have not settled there, as we know, as we've been seeing. Now you've got the temperature going higher and higher around Syria. Just the region as a whole. I mean, how do you look at it now? Do you look at it as unstable? Do you look at it, do you stay away from there? I mean, should South Africa take positions from a foreign policy perspective, for instance?
In some ways, a significant part of the region is unstable. I mean, even a country like Tunisia, which I think will turn out much better than these other two we're talking about. But at the moment, you know, things are hot. Certainly, this is the kind of time that South Africa should be taking strong policy positions. I think South Africa took a very good position on Egypt following the African Union, and the position on Syria has been cautious. I think that the caution, I mean, at some points I was critical of that. I thought that they should be much more forthright. But I think the caution at this point in time is useful for now, but also it means that what has happened, if the Geneva II conference doesn't happen, that all the actors have basically, their attempts have expired. And you'll now need, if there's going to be a political solution, actors that have not been involved already. And South Africa is one of those, South Africa, Brazil, India, for example, that could perhaps in a couple of months say, well, nothing else is working, maybe we can come with an independent position. So I think South Africa needs to constantly stay plugged into the Middle East, and be much more forthright with its positions.
Okay, now thank you very much. That's Naeem Jeenah from the Afro-Middle East Centre.
News that moves. eNCA.com.